I think a lot of people upgrade GPUs every other generation. I know some people, every generation, some people use their GPU until it's literally falling apart, but can't start up a game. But the point is, I think a lot of people might have bought a 3080, skipped the 4080, looking at the 5080. 5080 is a bit underwhelming from a generational uplift point, but it does still offer more performance than the 4080 did. So this video is focusing on what would the upgrade feel like to go from a 3080 to a 5080. And let me pause it right here. One thing you get is more VRAM, because the 5080 has 16 gigabytes, the original 3080 had 10, although they shortly afterwards launched a 12 gigabyte model. I'm actually testing the 12 gigabyte model in this video, but overall performance-wise, it's about a 3% difference, unless you're running out of VRAM. Now, I recommended on my channel that people buy the 12 gigabyte version because during the crypto boom, if you were buying a 3080, the 10 and 12 gigabyte models both were selling at crazy prices and they were pretty similar priced. And I predicted that the 2 gigabytes extra VRAM would come in handy. But like I said, performance-wise, if you're on a 10 gigabyte card, this is about the same. However, there are settings I'll be running in this video where maybe on your 10 gigabyte card, you would have had turned textures down a little bit more or something like that to stay within that VRAM buffer. Here we're seeing an example of Indiana Jones and the Great Circle absolutely destroying 12 gigabytes at max settings, 4K Supreme. I'm not turning on full RT, but just 4K here. However, you go down to 1440p Supreme, you're okay. If I go back to that 4K footage though, notice that all I'm adjusting is the texture cache from Supreme down to very Ultra, and then we're up and running at a native 4K 55 FPS, which is actually pretty good. So the 3080 is actually still pretty capable, but having less VRAM is annoying, and even if you are turning down VRAM to stay within the buffer, the 5080 is still 67% faster in this test. The exact differences are going to vary quite a bit. For example, if we go into Cyberpunk and the new DLSS performance transformer model and using full-on path tracing, I'm actually going to see pretty much the biggest lead we'll see in this entire video, which is the 5080 more than twice as fast as the 3080, just about double it, 60 FPS versus 29. Although, again, do keep in mind that this is running the new DLSS transformer model, which does run okay on the 3080, but the 3080's older tensor cores do have a bit more trouble running it. So that's why we're seeing a larger than expected uplift here for the 5080 versus 3080 than we'll see in a lot of our tests. And I'd say this is an example of something that the 5080 is going to give you a much better experience at than the 3080. 4K path tracing using the new transformer model for performance mode upscaling. The 5080 is able to hit about 60 FPS here, and that's not using any frame gen, but the 3080 is hanging out at 29. So I'd say this is the difference between very playable, and I absolutely would not even try to do this. If you go down to 1440p RT overdrive, DLSS quality transformer model, and I'll slide myself out of the way here, we can see that still the 3080 is not giving you a great experience. We're at 37 FPS, whereas the 5080 is at 73. So if you're on a 1440p display and you're itching to do those heavy path tracing workloads, the 3080 is struggling. The 5080 is very, very usable with just quality level upscaling. However, if you use the CNN model, the older model, the Transformer model is the new one we just got, performance is better on the 3080 compared to the Transformer model. I'm actually getting up to 47 FPS now, which is a pretty big change. It's especially the ray reconstruction that's pretty heavy on the 3080 using the Transformer model. But still, at 47 FPS, I would still argue that this isn't particularly usable. Whereas the 5080 again is hitting 77 FPS, so this is still a much better experience on that 5080. So one of the biggest things you'll see moving to the 5080 is a much more usable path tracing experience, especially at 1440p, where I think the 5080 does deliver a pretty great overall experience there. Now at 1080p, I'm not going to do a lot of testing in this video. In fact, I think this is the only test I run at 1080p. This is showing native RT overdrive path tracing, but really you have to go down to 1080p before either of them give a reasonable frame rate number at a native resolution with no DLSS, and the 5080 is only hitting 64 FPS here. The 3080 is down to 38. So, but honestly, I think most people buying 80 class GPUs are probably above a 1080p display unless you're mostly targeting esports, in which case path tracing is probably not really your main concern. Here we're back to that Indiana Jones the Great Circle test, again at 4K Supreme. If you go down to the very ultra texture cache, which still loads in the same high-res textures, just they might flip in at a closer draw distance. We're seeing a 67% advantage for the 5080. It's 92 versus 55 FPS though. So honestly, if you kicked on some DLSS quality, you'd probably be getting a pretty good experience even on the 3080. And if we go down to 1440p Supreme, they're both giving a great experience, 90 versus 138, and they're both totally maxed out, other than the full RT mode, which I didn't test here. However, it's a lot like the Cyberpunk path tracing, where the 5080 is going to be giving a pretty usable experience, especially at 1440p with DLSS quality in the full RT mode, whereas the 3080 is not going to be as usable. Another real popular engine is Unreal Engine 5. Silent Hill 2 is a big graphical showcase, and if you max the thing out 4K epic settings with the hardware ray tracing turned on, honestly, neither GPU is giving you a great experience here at native 4K, 46 versus 27. So while it's a 70% lead for the 5080, I don't think these are the settings you'd really use on either GPU. If you kick on DLSS quality though, now the 5080 is giving you 67 FPS, whereas the 3080 is only at 43. So this is an example of settings that are pretty usable on the 5080, but maybe not so usable on the 3080. It's a 56% advantage for the 5080. If you go all the way down to DLSS performance mode, the 3080 is still not at 60 FPS, although 55 is very playable in this game. It's a pretty slow-paced game. The 5080 is hitting 88 though, and it's a 60% advantage over the 3080. Honestly though, I think the 3080 would probably just need to turn down graphics settings a little bit and not just max this game out. One option is to turn off the hardware ray tracing and just use the software-based Lumen, in which case 4K epic settings, native resolution is still a bit much for both GPUs, 53 versus 32 FPS, 66% lead for the 5080, but I really think at native 4K, honestly just kick on DLSS quality. And now the 5080 is hitting 85 FPS, which gives it a 73% lead over the 3080, which is hitting 49. Kind of playable in this slow pace of a game, but I'd probably still really actually prefer a bit more from the 3080. So really you'd probably need to either go more aggressive on DLSS or even turn things down further. But you might just be on 1440p. In which case, max settings, epic settings, hardware ray tracing turned on. The 5080 is hitting 77 FPS, no DLSS is needed, giving it a 64% advantage over the 3080, which is at 47 FPS. So again, this is the difference between native 1440p max settings being very playable and kind of a mid experience where you'd probably need to turn things down a bit. One option is to kick on DLSS quality, in which case the 3080 is now doing fine, 66 FPS, whereas the 5080 is a nice high refresh rate experience at 101 FPS, giving it a 53% advantage over the 3080. If we move on to turning off hardware ray tracing at 1440p, now the 3080 is giving 54 FPS without any upscaling, but the 5080 is giving 94. Definitely playable on both GPUs at these settings though. Now if we move on to a different Unreal Engine 5 game, this is Hellblade 2: Senua's Saga. The high settings are the highest settings in this. There is nothing above that. And there's also no hardware RT available in this game. We're getting 51 versus 33 FPS, so 54% lead for the 5080. But again, I really think kicking on DLSS quality makes sense here, even on the 5080. If we do that, the 5080 is now at 82 FPS, and everything still looks very good at DLSS quality at 4K output, and the 3080 is hitting 54. Honestly, a bit lower than I'd like to be, but at the same time, this is a very slow-paced game, so it's probably okay. However, you could either use more aggressive DLSS or turn down some graphic settings a little bit on the 3080 and still have a very playable experience here. If we're at 1440p resolution, honestly, the results are a lot like DLSS quality at 4K. Since we are, DLSS quality at 4K is rendering internally at 1440p, and there's a little bit of additional performance cost for the upscale. Anyway, 1440p high settings, native res, 84 FPS versus 56. Again, both of them could just play here without really turning anything down or using DLSS, although you could still do those things to get even higher FPS, especially on the 3080 you might want to a little bit. If we look at Final Fantasy 16 at 4K Ultra settings, the 3080 is only at 33, the 5080 is at 53, 61% advantage for the 5080. However, again, I'd want a higher frame rate, probably even on the 5080, so kicking on DLSS quality makes a lot of sense. That gets the 5080 up to 81 FPS, which now feels very good. 65% lead over the 3080, which is hitting 49 FPS, which again, I would say is not great. So I'd either use more aggressive DLSS or turn some other settings down on the 3080, but you could certainly get a playable experience. On Final Fantasy 16 at 1440p Ultra, the 5080's nice high refresh rate 92 FPS, which is giving it a 67% lead over the 3080, which is hitting 55. 55's playable, but I'd probably either kick on DLSS quality or turn things down a little bit or both to get a higher refresh rate experience on the 3080. If we take a look at Horizon Forbidden West at 4K very high, which is the maximum settings in the game, the 5080 is hitting 75 FPS, giving it a 47% lead over the 3080, which is hitting 51. This is again the difference between the 5080 could just run this at native just fine maxed out, and the 3080 is probably, it's playable, but you'd probably want to do something. One option, kick on DLSS quality, which at 4K looks quite good, and now the 5080 is at a nice high refresh rate, 112, and the 3080 is at 68, so very playable. 65% lead for the 5080. If I was on the 3080, I'd probably consider either using a slightly more aggressive DLSS or turning some settings down a little bit or both. But again, very playable here on the 3080. If we go down to 1440p resolution max settings, I think both GPUs are doing great. The 5080 is at a nice high refresh rate, 130 FPS, giving a 67% lead over the 3080, but the 3080 is at 78 FPS, so you're still having great experience here, and that's before you turn down any settings or use any DLSS to even get a higher refresh rate experience if you desire that. God of War Ragnarok at 4K Ultra settings, which is the highest settings available in the game. The 5080 is at 85 FPS. Great experience. You might not even need any upscaling. 70% advantage over the 3080, which is hitting 50 FPS, which again, while you could play at those settings, you'd probably want to turn things down, either using DLSS or turning settings down, or both. If we just kick on DLSS quality, the 3080 is now at 72 FPS, which is just fine. You could turn things down more or use even more aggressive DLSS if you'd like. And the 5080 is hitting 118 FPS, giving a 64% advantage over the 3080. But again, very good experience on both GPUs there. If we go ahead and turn down to 1440p resolution, we're now at 117 FPS on the 5080 and 71 on the 3080. So both are doing very well, but one's getting a good experience and the other one's getting a nice high refresh rate experience. Keep in mind, the 3080 could use DLSS, could turn some settings down, could do both, and could still get a very high refresh rate experience in this game. In Ghost of Tsushima, 4K very high, that is the maximum settings in the game, and at native 4K resolution, the 5080 is at 76 FPS. Again, you could just leave it there, just max everything out at native 4K. 3080 can hit 51, which again, kind of playable, but you definitely want a higher frame rate. And honestly, kicking on DLSS quality is going to give you probably a better experience on both GPUs. The 5080 is now at a nice high refresh rate, 119, so if you have like a 4K 120 or 4K 144 monitor, it's probably how you play it on the 5080. And the 3080 is hitting 77 FPS, which is definitely a good experience, and of course you could turn down settings further or use a more aggressive DLSS or both if you want an even higher refresh rate experience on that 3080. On 1440p at max settings, native resolution, both are doing great, but the 5080 is 55% faster, giving a high refresh rate, 130 FPS, whereas the 3080 is at 84. 84 in a single-player game I think is just fine, but of course you could use DLSS or turn down some settings or both to get an even higher refresh rate experience. If we look at a more competitive type experience, Call of Duty Black Ops 6 at 4K, I'm testing out basic settings in this game, so unlike all the other games where I'm looking at like max settings or near max settings, here we're at pretty much the lowest settings that don't involve lowering the rendering resolution. Here we see the 3080 delivering 94 FPS and the 5080 delivering 145, 54% advantage for the 5080. Honestly, it would probably make sense to use DLSS to get an even higher refresh rate experience, especially in a competitive title. At 1440p basic settings, we're getting 154 FPS on the 3080 and 237 on the 5080, giving it a 54% lead, both getting a nice high refresh rate experience, and again, you could use DLSS to boost frame rates even further. And at 1080p resolution, the 5080 is delivering 303 FPS and is getting slightly CPU limited at times now. And the 3080 is delivering 206 FPS. So the 5080 is 47% faster, but probably a tiny bit of a CPU limitation at certain points during the benchmark, not the whole thing. Anyway, if you're not getting the kills at this frame rate, you probably need to work on your skill rather than your PC specs. And let's go ahead and give some final thoughts, because that's the last test that I ran here. So overall, what is the point and what is the summary? Well, if you just want to be like, how much faster is the 5080 than the 3080? Well, I got 62% as the geo mean of all tests, generally ranging between 47% faster and 107% faster, although the 100%, in other words, the doubling of performance was really only happening when we were trying to make the 3080 run the ray reconstruction with the new Transformer model, which reduces its performance a bit further compared to the new 50 series. In general, I think the 60-something% faster is more of the norm. And if you want to sort this more from a biggest advantage for the 5080 to least advantage for the 5080, it looks like this, rather than sorting by game. Again, if you're not sure how to read this type of graph, the numbers here are not frame rates. This is the percentage advantage for the 5080 in each game. So that's what you're at each setting. So in the 30-something tests I ran here, that's what it looks like, and it averages out to a geo mean of 62% faster for the 5080. But I think sometimes things like this hide a little bit of what does that mean in the actual experience, which is why I started with the side-by-sides. Because one thing I think it's really important to note is that in every single game, especially if you're on a 1440p monitor, you can still get a very good experience on the 3080. Especially because at 1440p, I'm generally testing the maximum settings the game has to offer, and usually without even turning on DLSS. In which case, the 3080 is still usually delivering a good experience, and then if you either kicked on DLSS quality or turned down settings to a little bit more of an optimized setting list, or both, the 3080 is still delivering, I would argue, a very good experience in almost every single game at 1440p, but again, just not maxing everything out and still hitting a high refresh rate like the 5080 can do. At 4K, you're gonna have to make a lot more compromises on the 3080 experience than you will on the 5080. But even the 5080 isn't just maxing everything out at 60 FPS native 4K, but again, kicking on DLSS quality or something like that, even in the big Unreal Engine 5 games, the 5080 is usually, that's all you need to do and you're good to go, unless we're talking path tracing. Whereas the 3080 usually gets somewhat playable there, but you'd really want to go to a more optimized settings list and then maybe use more aggressive DLSS. One of the things that the 5080, like I said, really opens up is more of the path tracing experiences, where at 4K, even the 5080 is going to need performance mode upscaling, and it might not be the most amazing experience. But especially at 1440p, the 5080 with DLSS quality is doing a really good job with the path tracing experiences. So that's one of the more transformative differences you would see even on a 1440p display with the 5080. So is the 5080 noticeably better and would improve your gaming experience compared to a 5080? Compared to a 3080? Yeah, absolutely. But is the 3080 still getting you a good experience? I would still say yes, especially if you're on a 1440p display. And even at 4K, I think you can make enough settings compromises that 3080 is still reasonable. The only reason why I'm really bringing this up is because of the GPU pricing market right now if you are watching this video at its time of release. Right now there's a lot of scarcity on 50 series cards, and we just got hit with some tariffs and things like that, meaning that while the 5080 is meant to cost $1,000, in the actual market, it's like $1,400 plus if you're finding things that are actually in stock. So I would say the 5080 is a really bad idea right now if you already have a 3080 while pricing remains like this. Because if you already have a 3080, my whole point is you can still play games just fine on a 3080. The 5080 gives you a better experience, but the pricing right now is awful. So I would recommend, if you're on a 3080, probably hold out and hope that pricing gets better. That being said, if you have $1,400 for a new GPU and you want to upgrade right now, will you get a noticeably better experience on the 5080? Absolutely. My other caveat on all of this is the 5080 is not that much better than the 4080 or the 4080 Super, and you could have already bought those for the last year or two. So if you already didn't upgrade to a 4080 from a 3080, are you really in that much of a rush to get the 5080? That's kind of my question on that, because you already waited, and this isn't offering much that those didn't already do. That being said, on the new market at least, the 4080s are basically out of stock, so they're actually even worse priced than the 5080 is right now. But if you had like maybe on the used market a 4080 Super that came in significantly less than the 5080, I think it might make more sense than spending $1,400 plus on a 5080. So anyway, basically, final summary is you do get a noticeably better experience on the 5080, generally more than 60% faster, but the 3080 is still good enough that you could probably hold out on it a while longer if you already have one. Especially due to GPU pricing right now. If you're watching this video in the future and 5080 pricing has improved significantly, then I would have less reservations about getting it, other than the fact that you already skipped the 4080 and it's not that much different. Anyway, I'm also going to be doing a 3080 versus 5090 video soon. If you're just like, what's the best thing most powerful graphics card I could possibly buy right now, although pricing on that kind of sucks too. How much better would that be? Anyway, so you can stay tuned for that video, and I hope all of you have an excellent day.